each year, there are over 22 million people around the world fleeing their homes due to war, persecution, and human rights violations. They're terrified and alone. And this is really important to kind of keep in mind, because when asylum seekers have to present their cases, they're being held to a standard that is really impossible to meet. And the standard is, prove to me that your persecutor harmed you for a very particular reason, on a certain date, in a certain manner. Show me the proof.
Thank you again for being here. And it's my pleasure to briefly introduce our speakers. It's an honor to have you all here. Anita Sharma is the Executive Director of the PAIR Project, which stands for Political Asylum Integration Representation Project, an organization that the Lenny Zakim funded for several years. And she'll talk about her organization's work and the asylum process. Sarath Suwang is a co-founder and current executive director of Providence Youth Street Movement, and among many other things, the national coordinator of the Southeast Asian Freedom Network. Sarath will teach us about how local leaders and youth are organizing to stop deportation. And Wilson Kapanja Jibu. Wilson, along with his wife Naomi and their infant daughter, survived a harrowing journey from their native Congo through South Africa to Brazil, Mexico, and finally coming to rest here in Boston in 2011. Wilson will share his personal journey of the asylum process. And our moderator for today's panel is Westy Egmont, whose life work has been focused on the human needs and social services of newcomer communities and on immigrant rights. He's also the co-chair of the Governor's Advisory Council on Immigrants and Refugees, having served as an advisor to 6 governors. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for being here, and it's going to be an important and special morning.
Morning. Thank you to Lenny Zakim for the great work that you have been doing for the city of Boston, in Massachusetts, and across the country, perhaps. I believe it's touching many lives, and it has touched my life and impacted my life. I'm grateful for all that. And I'm here this morning to share a few points of my life story coming to Boston, Massachusetts from Africa. My family and I, my wife and my little daughter, came here from Goma. Goma is a city on the eastern border of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And like so many, we were driven, yes, near Rwanda. Like so many, we were driven out of our home due to the outbreak of civil war and fled across the border to Rwanda due to the relentless prospect of war and no sign of peace returning to our city. We decided to make our way to America to seek asylum. From the time we decided, a little louder?
Yes, please.
From the time we decided to move to America to seek asylum here, the next 15 months was a long and difficult story. Our journey would take us to South America, Brazil, and Colombia, then the long journey, most of it on foot, up through Central America and Mexico, finally to the US border at McAllen, Texas. There we were interviewed by border security for 2 days and finally led into the country on probation with orders to report to JFK building in Boston. We were given our entry papers and shown the front door. Welcome to America. We had no idea where Boston was. It was my first time to arrive in America. And then you go into Massachusetts. If you're from Africa, you know America is New York and Washington, D.C. But then you're told to go to Massachusetts. I was wondering, is this place really America? Massachusetts, right along in your name. I figured that out, and we were able to get a bus. With the little money we had in the pocket, we took a bus from McAllen to as far north as Houston, and we were out of money. With the help of a friend, we called a friend who called a church in Houston to help us. We were able to secure a bus fare to Boston. After 3 days from taking the bus, we arrived at South Station. It was February of 2011. And bitter cold, and we had no winter clothes. Through research back then, I knew of some sort of travel aid rule. You could call some places and secure a hotel room for a night, because it was the first time for us arriving in the city. So I made few calls and was able to secure a room for us in a hotel in Boston. So we were safe for one night. And the next morning, I contacted the mayor's hotline. Back then, it was Mayor Menino. And I was referred to PAIR project. They welcomed me and my family, the pro bono lawyers who work with asylum seekers. They interviewed me, they took our case, and they referred us to RIM, the Refugee Immigration Ministry, based in Malden. Through RIM's Cloudar program, we went to Topsfield, in the North Shore, to live with Jim Corbett, a very good fellow who offered to house my family and me. The next few months, while living with Jim, we focused on trip to Boston Medical Center. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know the slide was going on as well. This is Goma, where I can speak about a little bit since I have 15 minutes once I'm done with this. Yeah. So the few months after arriving at Jim's house, we're focused on trips to Boston Medical Center, because my wife had happened to arrive here while pregnant. So we had to go from Topsfield to Boston Medical Center for prenatal care, and also to go to Cambridge to work with our lawyers on the work authorization and asylum grant. It was a very tedious and grueling process. In April of 2011, we successfully filed for EAD, which stands for Employment Authorization Documents. Over the next few months, I watched the mail very carefully to see if my work authorization document was coming. It should have arrived after 6 months from the time we applied. It didn't, and we got it late. We got it on December 31st, 2011. It's the last day of the year, but I was very excited to see it. I have been networking in the meantime, and I was able to find a job right away. In the spring of the employment authorization document, by the way, was given to me with a validity of only 6 months. So, which means as soon as you receive it, you start to reapply for the renewal, because it will take another 6 months before you get it. And so you'll see a picture of it. I managed to archive one. So in the spring of 2013, with the help of Classic, another legal pro bono lawyer services in Cambridge, we were able to apply for asylum, and then appeared before a now retired Judge Shapiro, who granted my family the asylum. That was in September of 2014. A year after that, we were eligible to apply for a green card, which we started the process. We had to reapply again in 2016 and reapply again in 2017. This is the green card I'm speaking about. The reason we had to reapply over and over and over is because the application were being lost. We applied and waited for 6 months. We didn't see any sign. When we called USCIS, they said that document probably lost. We didn't get it. We didn't see it. We had to reapply. Now, every time you apply for a green card, you have to also submit some medical report, which comes from a specific doctors that perform this test on asylum seekers, and will then send the results to the USCIS. This test for the family like mine will cost about $1,000. And each year we had to spend that much to get, because it's valid only for a year. So every time it had expired, we had to redo again the test, and they will resubmit it to the USCIS. And next year, same story. We've done that 3 times. So finally, the green cards arrived in 2018. But unfortunately, sorry if I'm gonna sound a little bit if I'm complaining. I have been complaining a lot. My green card was delivered to me with a mistake in it. My gender, the gender box said that I was a female, while I'm a male. We inquired about the mistake, and the USCIS told us that we had not indicated my gender correctly on the original application form. And they decided that it was my mistake, even though we did indicate my gender correctly, because we had copies of the original form that we submitted. So therefore, they made me jump the rope. I had to reapply again. You know what it means to reapply? Go get the medical forms again, go get the medical test, and then reapply. The reapplication process for me now was funny. I went to their offices to do the fingerprint again, and the lady was asking me, "So tell me, Wilson, are you really a male?" I said, "Yes, I have 2 children." And she said, "Oh, I also have 2 children." I'm like, "Okay, I don't know what to show you." Then she said, "I think I believe you." All right, so we reapplied. In 2018, that was in July of, that was in June of 2018, I reapplied just to correct the mistake on my green card. It's now almost the end of 2019, and I have not yet received that copy. I'm still waiting for it. Well, that's pretty much all I had to share this morning. Among many friends and the Episcopal clergy members, rabbis, friends such as Jude, the Catholic Charity, Pear, Classic, the pro bono lawyer, my family and I, all of them have helped my family and I to settle here in Massachusetts. We are also very grateful to the Lenny Zakim Fund, which the organization through which I was able to find a prospective employer when I was invited to speak. And even though this immigrant has been wandering for many months without a place to call home, you all greatly extended your hands to ensure that we had an address of our own here in Massachusetts. Thank you. I believe I still have about 5 minutes to speak of the pictures. So this is Goma, where I was born and where we departed from. I had another better picture, but it didn't open up, so we can go to the next. Goma used to be a beautiful place. This is our national park over there. It's called Virunga Park. And it used to be a very beautiful park before the war, when everything was fine. We used to have a lot of American tourists, European tourists, worldwide tourists. It used to be a beautiful place. And then the city was invaded. All those beautiful animals were replaced by this. This is actually one of the vehicles, not this one specifically, but this type of vehicle is what we used to escape. It's only those who could afford it were able to escape. Not everybody could bribe the soldier to get out. This is the journey in Colombia. Sometimes we were able to get on a bus, but most of the time we were marching. This is Jim. the very good fellow from Dobbsville, Jim and I, last year, we always meet and have a coffee one Sunday morning when the kids are doing Hebrew school. And so that's Jim. And Jasper was born when we arrived here. My wife was pregnant, and Jasper was born very healthy, and he's still very healthy. He's a good boy. He's now 8 years old. This was my first trip to New York. Finally, I'm in America. I used to think from Africa to America, in America, the roads were paved with gold. When we arrived here in 2011, it was actually paved with snow. And this is the employment document, authorization document. But yeah, it's valid from June 12 through February 19. So it's actually, it started to be, was that 6 months or 9 months or 8 months, something like that. But it was for a short period of time. So that was the document again. And finally we got a green card. That's my wife holding her green card. She was very happy. Hers, the gender was correct. Only on mine, the gender was messed up. Is there an next door? And that's just the family enjoying fun times, sometimes in Boston. Thank you very much.
On Wilson's story, Wilson shared with us what it means to be a refugee, to flee your home country, to leave everything behind, and to seek a safe haven. And so I'm going to talk about how organizations like PAIR and those of us on the ground help clients navigate the just incredibly complex immigration system, and how we help empower them. Because I always say, it's not my case, it's not my story. And so when you have to present these cases, it's not me who has to share all the horrible things I went to. It's the clients, and it's our job to really empower the clients and to give back their voices so they can tell their stories and win a safe haven in America. So next slide. So each year, there are over 22 million people around the world fleeing their homes due to war, persecution, and human rights violations, such as what Wilson actually just showed us on the screen. These are people who leave everything behind. They barely bring, even the clothes on their back. They're terrified and alone. And this is really important to kind of keep in mind, because when asylum seekers have to present their cases, they're being held to a standard that is really impossible to meet. And the standard is, prove to me that your persecutor harmed you for a very particular reason, on a certain date, in a certain manner. Show me the proof. And these are people who, they're just fleeing maybe with a bag, with their family. They're not carrying around documents. They certainly don't go to the persecutor and say, can you sign this affidavit for me so I can submit it to court? But really, that is the burden that's held against asylum seekers. So since 1989, PAIR and our network of volunteer attorneys have worked hard to close this gap between legal need and access to justice. In immigration court and before the asylum office, immigrants do not have a right to free counsel, although the stakes of deportation are life and death. So they come in and they have to deal with all of these laws, and I'm going to do a quick Immigration 101, Asylum 101 training to kind of give you guys an idea of how hard it would be for somebody like Wilson to fight his case pro se. PAIR is trying to fill in that gap. So an asylum seeker doesn't have a right to a free attorney, but if they connect to PAIR and other legal services, we will provide free attorneys. And because we work with many of the big Boston area law firms, our attorneys and our staff are putting in hundreds of hours to build these cases. We do this through 2 programs and 2 initiatives at PAIR. So we run a very large pro bono asylum program, which is to help non-detained asylum seekers with free representation and a whole suite of services, including social services coordination. We also run a detention program. So PAIR is the only nonprofit in Massachusetts with negotiated access to go into the detention facilities to provide legal orientation and free representation to asylum seekers who are being unjustly detained. Wilson shared that when he came to the border, he came to McAllen, Texas. All of us have heard of McAllen because that's where a lot of the children and families were being held last summer. Today, it would be very different for an asylum seeker who crossed the border, if they can even make it across the border. Immigration is not releasing even those who are applying for asylum, even those who pass a credible fear interview. So today, somebody like Wilson might actually remain detained, might remain in jail and have to fight their case in jail. And you can only sort of imagine how difficult that would be. Each year, PAIR serves over 1,500 clients from over 90 countries. And as I mentioned before, our goal is really truly to be there for the client, by their side, as they navigate this harrowing system, and to empower them to tell their story. Next slide. So why is it critical to have an attorney? Why, is it critical to have access to counsel? And that's because it's nearly impossible to win your case alone. Study after study show that asylum seekers are 5 times more likely to win if they have an attorney. And so we really feel it's our burden to make sure that we're able to help as many asylum seekers as possible. Access to justice, as I mentioned, access to counsel is critical. And since 1989, PAIR has helped over 10,000 clients and helped represent over 3,000 asylum seekers. Next slide, please. In last fiscal year, in fiscal year 18-19, we helped over 1,500 clients with both legal orientation and asylum intake, which is sort of the starting point of how an asylum seeker can get help. So, for example, for those who were detained, we went into the detention facilities and we explained to them why they're in detention. Why are you being held? Because a lot of detainees will say, I didn't commit a crime, why am I in jail? In Massachusetts, we don't have a federal ICE facility. People are held in county jails. I know, Sarath, you're probably going to talk about this a lot more. I just want to touch on it and give some context. And so people will say, why am I in this jumpsuit? Why do I have to wear shackles? And we have to explain to them why they're being held. Before this administration, if you were an asylum seeker, there was actually a process to gain release from custody for asylum seekers. Many would be held on an ankle monitor or have to do check-ins, but that is actually becoming increasingly difficult. So we do feel it's our job, and it's very important to at least explain the legal rights that immigrants have, whether they're in detention, to help them be able to explain their fear. So asylum seekers, to go to court, if they cross the border, they're going to be subject to an expedited deportation. To kind of prevent expedited deportation, they have to pass what's called a credible fear interview. They have to be able to prove that they have a fear of return. But most people who are fleeing because of past trauma, when they're being held in a jail, and they're being questioned by a government officer with guns and a uniform, are actually experiencing re-traumatization, because many of them have in fact been tortured by government officials, and they don't know who they can trust. So many won't share their story. Many will say, we're not afraid, but then when PAIR meets them, they'll say, no, I'm afraid, and I've suffered this horrible torture, and look, I have scars. And so what we try to do is we try to actually meet with people even before they have their credible fear process, to explain to them how important it is. You don't have to share your entire story, but you have to be able to explain to an officer, to an asylum officer, why you're afraid to go back, what happened to you in the past, and what might happen. And I can't tell you how many times we sort of get cases, and they're very strong cases, but we read the notes, the initial interview notes, and it says, no fear, or nothing bad happened to me. And then we go to court, and we've built these cases, and we've submitted hundreds of pages of corroborating evidence, and the judge will say, but you told Border Patrol you weren't afraid. I don't believe you, case denied. So the first sort of part is intake and screening, legal consultation, explaining of rights, and then actually the cases that we're able to take is full representation from the beginning to the end. Unfortunately, although our goal is to serve as many asylum seekers who come to us, for every asylum seeker's case that we take on, we turn one away. And this is something we are trying to work. We've been expanding. When I started at PAIR 16 years ago, we were 3 staff members. I was the only full-time person. 5 years ago, when I started as an executive director, there were 5 of us on staff. Today, there are 13. We're going to, continue to add staff next year, but it hasn't been enough because there are more and more people fleeing their homes and coming to the U.S. for a safe haven. Instead of welcoming them into the U.S., the Immigration Service has been detaining more and more people, and it's been very difficult for us to keep up with those services. Next slide, please. So as I said before, our goal is really to work with clients to explain the system to them. We as attorneys, we can pull the cases together, we can come up with brilliant legal theory, but if our clients can't articulate that in front of an adjudicator or in front of a judge or an asylum officer, they're not going to win the cases. The judges, the asylum officers are not interested in hearing our cases. So we really, really work very hard. For example, yesterday I was working with a political activist from Venezuela. She came into my office. I was helping her draft her affidavit, and I told her, this meeting is about you. You are in control. This is your story. You can stop me at any time. If you don't like a question I'm asking, you can say, Anita, I'm not going to answer that question today. I'm here to help you tell your story. And I really do feel like my role is to empower the client to share his or her story. Next slide. As I mentioned before, we do this through our programs. We have a very, very successful and large asylum and detention program. But we also, after the elections, couldn't keep up with the phone calls that we were receiving from community members who were saying, there's so many changes in the law, or I hear rumors about changes in the law. What do I do? Should I go underground? Should I abandon my case? Should I stop getting free health care? And we were picking up the phones and trying to quell the rumors, but we realized that we needed to be out in the community. And I would say for PAIR, and for most of the time that I've been at PAIR, I was a staff attorney. I worked in my office. I helped people fill out forms. I helped people draft their affidavits. I prepared them, to win their cases. But I never really saw the value of me being out in the community doing, know your rights or talking to people, I would say, until the elections, where I realized that there's so much confusion. And, I have to say I'm confused a lot of the time about what the law is. Today, tomorrow it's something else. So I decided that we should just go out. We should take what we know and go out. And even if our messages we don't know right now, the law hasn't changed, we're not sure what's going to happen, that message is going to be stronger than people kind of following rumors or taking bad advice. And there's started to be a lot of scams happening where, we got calls. A lawyer says if I give him $10,000, he'll file this form for me and I'll be okay. And no, there's no such form. Again, in early 2017, I thought maybe we'll do a handful of these community know your rights. We've done over 600 to 14,000 community members. We can't actually, so our rule is we never say no to a community know your rights. If somebody wants us in the community, we will be there. And it's been very challenging for us to keep up, but the way we do it is through our volunteer attorneys. We have about 300 volunteers who just do community know your rights. They're not the ones working on full cases, but it's been an incredible service. I've sort of mentioned a little bit about our asylum program, but we serve about 600 asylum seekers. There are 8 attorneys on staff. There are 4 in the asylum program and 4 in the detention program, including me, and the 4 of us certainly don't take on 600 cases. But what we do is we go out to the big law firms and we convince attorneys to take these cases. We mentor, we train them, we handhold. Questions from what color paper should I file that form on to I have this judge, can you help me prepare the case? Next slide. So I know everybody was very interested in why asylum, why do people apply for asylum? It's actually one of the strongest protections for a refugee. for somebody who's coming to the United States. So a refugee is somebody who's been processed outside. An asylum seeker is somebody who's at the border or within the United States. And as Wilson was saying, if you win asylum, you can reunite with your family. Your family members can get asylum status. They can get their green cards. It is a grueling process. So when I hear people say to me, but aren't a lot of your clients committing fraud? I would say people would not go through the process. It takes about 6 to 8 years to get asylum, during which time most of our clients are separated from their families. It is one of the most intense processes. It's not just filling out a paper and submitting it for adjudication. The asylum officers, the judges, the government prosecutors grill our clients for hours. If you say on one day, you have one date, and on the other day, you happen to say the night before or the morning after, your case can be denied. It's a system that is really set up for asylum seekers to fail. Which is why it's really critical just to have an attorney kind of help you through, practice. A lot of people, even though supposedly the asylum process is before an asylum office is supposed to be non-adversarial, it's incredibly adversarial. So it's always really helpful to have the attorney there who can kind of practice and help if there's something that goes wrong at an interview or in court, to be an advocate. Next slide. So if I were going to give a training, which I usually do is a 3-hour training, I would go through the law and how the laws, how we in the U.S. provide asylum protection and what clients have to prove. Next slide. This is the refugee definition, which is what asylum seekers have to prove. It's one sentence, but there are thousands and thousands of cases that help us define each one of these terms that you see up here. Next slide. As I mentioned before, there are many, many barriers to asylum. It's just, I don't even know how asylum seekers, with all of their hope and the resilience of that journey coming to the U.S., when they get here and they face these hurdles and they see what they have to prove, and even filling out the 12-page asylum form, how they continue to do it. I'm inspired by my clients on a daily basis because they're just so strong and they are so full of hope. These are people who have been betrayed by another human being, by people that they were supposed to trust. And then they come to another country, and instead of being welcomed and helped and sort of handheld in the process, they're being imprisoned. They're being told that they don't belong here. The rhetoric today has been asylum seekers are not welcomed, and yet they're still willing to fight, to allow our attorneys to hold their hands and walk them through the process. And I know I'm out of time. I was going to talk a little bit more. Please. Are you sure? Okay, so I'll go through it quickly. A lot of what I was going to say is just on sort of the barriers to winning asylum and how that becomes even more difficult for people who are detained. And Sarath, I know you're going to talk more about detention, so I won't go into it too much. But as many of you have heard, which is actually really very interesting. So PAIR has been doing detention work since 1989. We were actually formed out of a workplace raid where 85 Central Americans were arrested, all asylum seekers, and detained in the North End. And yet I feel like for most of the time that I've been at PAIR, people actually haven't really understood what it means to be an immigrant who is detained. Even the big law firms where we go and we try to recruit attorneys have always said to me, well, if they're in jail, they must be criminals. And even though I say, no, it's a civil proceeding, they are not criminals, they are legitimate asylum seekers, but because of our laws, we have the ability to detain them. In the last, I would say, year and a half, that has completely shifted. People are now coming to us and say, hey, I saw in the news, the children being detained or the families being detained or asylum seekers, just having to fight their cases in jail. What can I do? And that has, to me, it's been spectacular. There are nearly over 256,000 people, immigrants, being detained across the United States. I was trying to get updated figures from Massachusetts, but the last figure I saw is there are about 3,000 immigrants who are detained in Massachusetts throughout the year. That number must have grown because our jails have expanded, where there are new units in Plymouth. There are more and more detainees being held in Greenfield, Mass. So this is just a map of where the major jails, the county jails where immigrants are held in Massachusetts. That's in South Bay, Bristol County, Plymouth County, and Greenfield, Massachusetts. And PAIR does legal orientation, know your rights, and one-on-one consultation and free legal representation to all of these prisons, to all the immigrants in the prisons. I mentioned a little bit about our community outreach work. It actually came from our detention work. The Know Your Rights we do in detention is what we have taken to the community. I have to admit there's a lot of confusion even on our part. So we do these presentations in schools, to service providers, to even like DCF, certainly places of worship, and immigrant community centers. And we grapple with, in the last week, there have been two major changes to the law. One, went to the U.S. District Court, and the U.S. District Court came up with a decision, and then it went to federal court, and they had another decision, and then 2 days ago, the federal court, undid its decision. And so it's so confusing. It's really confusing for us as lawyers to figure out, what does this mean? I can't even imagine sort of being in the community trying to figure out, what does that law mean? What is that order that the court issued? How does that impact me? And these are the things that we're trying to help people figure out. Next slide. Also, as many of you have heard, women and children have been fleeing their countries, many from Central America, and coming to the United States, and really sort of a panic and sense of grave danger. And PAIR recently started a Justice for Immigrant Families initiative, specifically to work with this population, women and children, accompanied and unaccompanied, with wraparound social services. So many, you can imagine, many asylum seekers who come here, they have nothing. They don't even, they don't have family members. They don't have a community to turn to. They don't know how to, get health care, or to enroll their child in school. And so PAIR is trying to help the women and children that we serve with these wraparound services. I'm going to sort of end here by saying, at PAIR, I always feel like my work is to serve my clients, who are really the ones who carry the burden of their story, of their case, and have to carry the burden of facing the incredibly cruel and complex system that we've set up in the United States to help asylum seekers. That's what it's supposed to be, right? Our laws were to be to protect asylum seekers and to help them, but it doesn't feel like that anymore. And so at PAIR, we do everything we can to really, with that in mind, to have sort of a holistic, client-based approach to our legal work. So we're not just lawyers filling out forms, hearing stories, and processing them and then moving on to the next one. It really is listening to the clients, following what they want and what they need, and then helping them through their cases. So I thank you so much for listening to what I have to say, and I look forward to your questions.
My name is Sarath Sung. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous. I don't know why. I talk about this all the time, so bear with me. Part of it's because I have my parents up here, and my niece. So anyway, good morning. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am a co-founder and currently the executive director of Providence Youth Student Movement, or PRISM, in Rhode Island, in Providence, Rhode Island. And like I said earlier, I'm also a co-chair of ARISE, the Alliance of Rhode Island Southeast Asians for Education. So a community group that works with young people to support their educational goals and dreams. I'm also the national director for the Southeast Asian Freedom Network, a movement, family, and network of grassroots-based building Southeast Asian organizations across the country that are working together, that we founded to fight deportation of Southeast Asians. And among all that, I'm also a refugee. I was born when when the capital city of Cambodia fell in 1975 to communist forces, my parents, like hundreds and thousands of other refugees in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, fled by foot to nearby refugee camps. My parents and my family were able to make it to the biggest refugee camp in Thailand called Kavidang, and that's where I was born. And then we stayed there for a couple of years, went to a re-education camp in the Philippines, where my younger sibling was born, and then we eventually resettled here in the United States. First in Indiana, because a wonderful family took us in. And then we eventually made our way here to Boston, where we grew up in the beautiful gateway city of Revere, Massachusetts. So I grew up in Revere. Have a little bit of Revere accent too. Revere High School, class of '98, and became an organizer, because I think growing up as a Cambodian refugee in the 80s and 90s in Revere in Boston was kind of hard. At that time, there was a war on drugs. There was a lot of policies and a culture of sort of locking up young people, particularly poor young people, particularly people of color. And I was sort of, and you know, in my community, we just sort of would just face genocide, faced war, came here, and tried really to survive, right? And some of us, like we said, some of us were able to survive better than others. And so for me, I remember being 13 years old and having sort of spent the first 10 years of the first 8 years of my life here, watching the school system push my siblings and my community out, watching the police accuse us of being gang members and treating us as criminals. And you know, even in Revere in the early 90s, there was an arson of a whole street of homes that was set on fire because those homes were full of Cambodian refugees like me. And so for me, I grew up really angry. I didn't understand what was happening. My parents and the elders sort of was going through their own shock and PTSD. And so I was kind of like, what is going on? And when I was walking by at 13 years old, my best friend was killed by the police at that time too. And so I was just sort of full of rage. And I walked by a community center and saw a flyer that said, "Come on in, we have free comic book art classes." I'm a comic book geek. It was my way to escape what was happening around me. And so I walked in and just became sort of like drawn into organizing. They taught me two really important lessons. They said, "Sarath, everything that's happening to you all, to your community, it's not your fault." And that was really important for me to understand. As a community, as people that grew up under Buddhism and believing that in karma, that things were going to come back to us, it was important for me to understand that it was not our fault. The second thing that it taught me that was really important to me was not only is it not your fault, but if the community and young people came together, we can make change happen. And those sort of two lessons for me really sort of cemented in my heart that like, it took the rage that I was having and I was building and to channel it into making changes in my community. So I was getting emotional. Thank you, Wilson, for sharing your story. I think in these political times, in these moments, it's really important to listen to these stories and to hear individual stories, individual family stories, because all we hear sometimes, all we see is those pictures that sometimes feel so far removed. We hear the statistics, we hear the numbers, but it's actually the real stories that when you sit down and listen to them that actually, I think for me, makes a big difference. Thank you, Anita, for the work that you and Per do. In the work that I'm going to talk about, more than ever, it's become really crucial for community organizations and community organizers to strongly connect with legal groups and lawyers to really make sure, and then social service providers to make sure that we do the whole, what we call the wraparound, the holistic approach to really supporting vulnerable communities in these times. Thanks, Evie, for bringing me here. Evie's awesome. Thank you so much. Yes, so I grew up in Revere, and when it was time for me to go to college, I applied to, and to my surprise, got accepted to Brown University in Providence, and that's how I sort of got to Rhode Island. And you know, I went to Brown because of the liberal image, because it's all organizers, everybody's all an activist. And so I went there, started spending more time off campus than I did on campus. Good thing my parents can't understand what I just said there. And after I started doing community work, started sort of like volunteering and working with immigrant refugee children, because I knew what that felt like. And then after leaving college, I founded Providence Youth Student Movement. And so just to quickly talk about Providence Youth Student Movement, we are celebrating our 18th year this year. And we were founded with the purpose of organizing Southeast Asian young people. And I'm going to explain what Southeast Asians are, who we are. LGBTQ, queer and trans youth of color, and who we call survivors of state violence. Those are refugees, there are those are families and communities that survive police brutality. There are families and communities who are still being terrorized by ICE to this day, right? We organize those sort of folks, and sometimes, like me, we're all part of 3 groups. And we organize those folks to build brave, safe spaces and communities, do the leadership development, and then do campaigns to just sort of change policy and change the city around us. So these pictures are actually not in any order. They're just sort of like snapshots from the past year around the work, the meetings, the actions, and the organizing we've done. So in order to tell the story, I'm going to try my best to sort of give a snapshot about who Southeast Asians are. In Massachusetts, we're home to the second biggest Cambodian population in the country. First is Long Beach, California, and second is the North Shore, predominantly mostly in Lowell, Massachusetts. Revere, Lynn, Chelsea were sort of where I grew up. And to talk about, so I'm here today a lot of our work doesn't actually sort of talk about the asylum-seeking folks, but I do want to talk about the deportation of individuals of Southeast Asian with criminal convictions. And I think that's always been a piece of the immigrant and refugee community that always sort of get left out. So to understand where we are right now, I just want to talk a little bit about the past. The Vietnam War, we all know what the Vietnam War is, right? We call it the American War, because for us, it was about the US being in Southeast Asia. And I think another piece that always gets left out in kind of these kind of sort of conversations and discussions is actually a lot of the refugees that are coming to the borders right now are here because we were there. They're here because the U.S. was in our home countries and helped to destabilize the countries enough to cause this massive refugee flow. And I think that's really important to understand and to keep on echoing, because then it gives us and folks who are trying to push away more of a sense of responsibility. If we cause instability in your home and you come to our home to find refuge, then it is our obligation to make sure that you are safe. So yes, the U.S. was in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. You know, in the 80s, it was to stop communism. Communists were the bad, scary boogeymen. Now it's the terrorists, right? It's sort of still the same thing, just different words. So the Vietnam War, the American War, was officially started. It was never actually official. It was a secret war. It was an illegal war, whatever that means, right? It was never sanctioned by Congress, but it was a war that the U.S. took part in. And lasted about 20 years, from 1955 to 1975. And since 1975, over 1 million refugees from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, refugees like me, like my parents, resettled here in the United States, making Southeast Asian refugees the largest refugee community to come to U.S. history, into the U.S. But we didn't face the same barriers when coming here. The U.S. office opened up the Office of Refugee Resettlement and passed a Refugee Resettlement Act in 1980 to make sure that we as Southeast Asian refugees had a process to get our citizenship, to get our green card, to get a Social Security card. So we actually, in terms of just coming into here like in a in the legal way, we were actually pretty good, right? Which, for me, like, just hearing about what's happening right now is like horrific to understand, because I'm thinking about, wow, in the 80s, 70s, and 80s when we came, imagine if we came and we were told to go away. Imagine if we came and we were put into detention centers. That would have been a whole other sort of situation for us. So we were able to have a pathway for us to come here into the United States. Just some quick statistics, just to sort of talk about devastation. In a 10-year period in the country of Laos, the U.S. dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs. 2 million tons of bombs in a 10-year period in Laos, with over 580,000 bombing missions, right? Equal to a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years. For 9 years, every 8 minutes, there was a plane load of bombs that dropped in your country, right? Making Laos the most heavily bombed country per capita in history, right? And to this day, there are millions of tons of bombs in Laos that did not even explode, because the U.S. was so interested in carpet bombing Laos that a lot of times the planes flew so low, and when the bombs dropped, they were so low that they didn't detonate. And to this day, bombs are still detonating in Southeast Asia across the countryside. But we forget about that. Cambodia was also heavily bombed. Nixon at that time really wanted to strike Vietnam through Cambodia. So bombing the countryside of Cambodia to be able to weaken the supply route to Vietnam. Oh shoot. Okay. But then that also created a genocide in Cambodia that claimed the life of over 2 million of Cambodians in a 10-year time frame. That's 1 out of 4 Cambodians at that time. And so, when we came here, we settled into struggling, isolated neighborhoods without resources, and without the adequate resources to address the trauma, to address the resettlement process for us. And many of us grew up in communities with poverty, with lack of resources, and also a lot of racialized bullying at that time. In the 80s and 90s, the U.S. wanted to forget the Vietnam War. We showed up as a reminder of this war. And like I said earlier, we also came to the United States in a perfect storm of tough on crime policies and harsh immigration reform, right? There was mandatory minimum sentences, gang injunctions, the war on drugs, trying a lot of our children as adults in court, right? Just in between the 1960 and the 2000s, the U.S. prison population quadrupled, right? So we came at a time when the prison was expanding, and a lot of us were sort of perfectly pushed into that system. Okay, I'm gonna try to make it quick. Shoot. So, all that to say, I want to paint a picture about sort of the conditions that we were in coming into the 80s and 90s, where we were coming from, and then we know about the Oklahoma City bombing, right? That happened. It was a U.S. citizen that did it, but who got blamed for it? It was immigrants and refugees, right? 9/11 happened, right? And so at that point, this country was not having a lot of love for immigrant folks, right? And so then in 2002, the U.S. signed a repatriation agreement with Cambodia, a memorandum of understanding that would deport Cambodian Americans who have criminal convictions who are not citizens to Cambodia, back to the land of our nightmares, right? Of genocide. So for the past 18 years, Cambodians have been deported. And as of 2 years ago, after the administration took over, Vietnamese Americans are now eligible for deportation. And in 2017, ICE began ramping up efforts to deport Southeast Asian Americans in ways that we have never seen before. The deportation of Cambodian Americans increased almost 300% since the administration took over. And the number of people deported to Vietnam increased 300% around that time, right? And right now, as it stands, and the U.S. has imposed sanctions on Laos to pressure Laos to accept back folks with deportation orders. So right now, currently, there are over 14,000 Southeast Asians with deportation orders living in the United States. Okay. What do we do about this? What have we been doing about this? I'm gonna try to make it really quick. So what do? You're facing a machine that was honestly built way before the Trump administration. The Obama administration deported more folks than any other sort of presidencies combined. The Obama administration created a deportation machine that this current administration took and is now running with it, right? So for me and for my community, this battle has been way before 2016, before the elections in 2016. And it's way before that, and it's going to continue even after this administration leaves office, right? So it's part of a larger system for us. How do we fight back? Oof. Okay, I'm going to talk about two organizations and two ways that we've fought back. First is what I mentioned earlier, the Southeast Asian Freedom Network, right? So for us as an organization, we really believe the legal folks are just sort of instrumental in freeing our people and making sure our people are safe. We believe the social services folks are needed to make sure that our communities and our families are whole. We also really believe that we need community organizing to make sure that our communities and our families understand their power and can actually push to make change happen, right? And so the Southeast Asian Freedom Network was founded to respond to the deportation of Cambodian Americans and is now responding to the deportation of Vietnamese Americans and will be responding to the deportation of Lao Americans. And once we do all that, we will still continue to fight for the end to deportation for everybody, right? But we do it in a very clear way. We do it with the power of young people. We do it with the power of women and children in our communities. And we do it with the power of marginalized communities like the LGBT communities. We know that these communities, oftentimes, even in moments of crisis, even in moments of just sort of everyday community, are the ones who actually speak up and the ones who actually organize and actually the ones who protect and take care of each other. We also know that the majority of folks living with deportation order are men, but we also know that it's the people around those men that actually protect and support them. So we want to harness that power in the community to really make these changes to protect each other. So what do? So nationally, we have a threefold strategy. We've been doing it for 18 years now, and every so often we kind of rechange it a little bit because laws change, because administrations change. So right now we have a threefold strategy. One is a legal strategy. So the Asian Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus in California has been instrumental in providing the legal support for Southeast Asian deportation orders. They've actually been able to return 2 people who've been deported, which is actually a really big deal, right? And in Massachusetts, we're actually in the process, crossing our fingers, of actually returning one person in the next few months. So that's to say that our movement lawyers, our community lawyers have been crucial to the defense work of our folks, but it's only been piecemeal, it's only individual. We want the whole overhaul of the deportation stuff for Southeast Asians, right? So we've been able to protect individuals. There was a flight that happened in July, this past month. What we need to understand is every 4 months, the Southeast Asian community gets raided for the past 18 years. Every 4 months, the community knows once a plane lands, the next 3 months, ICE is knocking on doors. ICE is grabbing, like in Providence, a couple months ago, a father was coming home from work, his daughter was playing in the front yard, he didn't even reach the door. ICE grabbed him, and the daughter's 10 years old. And she's like, what's happening? They gave her a piece of paper, give this to your mom when she comes home. Grabbed him in front of her and just took off, right? This is happening every 4 months for us. And so then we also have a policy strategy. We're looking at amending the Refugee Resettlement Act. We're looking at the awful draconian 96 laws to figure out some relief for our community members. But it's hard to change anything right now in DC or the laws, but we're gonna try. And the other piece is the mobilizing and community organizing. And that means that we're gonna do and commit to doing whatever is necessary to protect our people. That means that if we need to chain ourselves to those ICE vans that are taking our people to the detention centers, we're going to do that. That means that if we have to provide sanctuary housing and options for families when ICE comes, we are going to do that. That means if we have to get people to rally and storm the State House to make sure that our elected officials do what they're supposed to be doing to protect us, we're going to do all that. And we've been doing all that for the past 18 years. And we're going to step it up this next year or so. So CFEN, that's sort of our three main things, right? What we're focusing on a national level, and then supporting each other locally. Lastly, after the administration took over in 2016, in Rhode Island, I love Rhode Island now. I'm probably not gonna come back to Massachusetts, y'all. I'm gonna stay in Rhode Island. In Rhode Island, a bunch of us, community organizations, came together and said, we know, after the elections took over that winter, we came together and said, we know what's coming down the line. We faced this before. And so we came together to form a coalition called the Alliance to Mobilize Our Resistance, AMOR, as an acronym, to provide a few things. To one, be the first line of deportation defense that our community faces. Secondly, to provide legal support and services locally, building a network of lawyers, of agencies that can provide folks support. And thirdly, to organize. So that, and to organize in a different, we're gonna do all those direct actions too, but also organize in a different way around getting members and getting folks, community members to provide childcare, to provide resources, to donate, to mobilize folks who haven't been mobilized before, to really put in your resource and your action where your mouth is to protect our families. Gata, in this front row, is the director of the AMOR Alliance in Rhode Island. Please come talk to her. She's amazing and can speak much better than I can. I'm going to wrap it up, and all this to say this. In these times, we need lawyers more than ever, especially immigration criminal lawyers, because for folks like the communities that we work with, the doors get shut on them, the phones get hung up on them once they hear that they have a criminal conviction. You know, that once they hear that this person's a criminal, they have a conviction, that's why being deported, so many doors close on them. We need lawyers and legal agencies to understand that felons are also our family. We need lawyers and legal agencies to understand, to really think critically about what it means for a person, for a young refugee to have a criminal conviction, to have served their time that the justice system had told them, to serve double that time in detention, and then to come out and now serve more time to being deported, right? We have to think about what justice is in this country. And secondly, we need to really break apart that good-bad immigrant dichotomy, right? So we need the legal community. We also need the social services community more than ever to provide the real basic needs. I'm talking about driving people, able to support people to drive to work, making sure that children has childcare when they get detained, right? Making sure people have food for rent, money for rent, money for food. And lastly, and we'll keep on saying this, we need to organize as a community, as a people, and we need to organize in ways that we've never seen before. And if that means we have to really think critically, all of us individually as communities, about what real solidarity looks like, beyond just posting on Facebook, beyond just saying you attend a Facebook event, beyond even just going to a rally. We need to do more than that. We need people to shut down ICE detention centers. We need people to stop planes from taking off. And we need people to protect refugees in your homes and put yourself in that line. First, to me, in this moment in time, that's really what solidarity looks like, and that's the kind of solidarity that we need. So, thank you all.
And that's part of the strategy, is stay on the top of the news, have more things that are coming at you, keep confusion. It gives power to the administration to do things, because you can't fight yesterday's terrible news announcement because today's is just as bad. It's an incredible strategy to watch. But I would remind you that Clinton and Reno started the wall. I would remind you that Obama had deported many more people than Trump has deported, even in the same time period. So we have to keep a perspective that the system stinks, right? The system has problems in its core. the laws that have not been written are critical for us to understand, as well as the laws that have been written. And I just want to take us into that larger perspective, because it's not about just today and the bad news of today. It is really an abiding set of problems of a country living on 1965 laws, which are significantly outdated and need to be changed. The other thing to say is that, I spent a lot of my career doing refugee work, and the refugees are an incredible part of America. 3 million refugees. Our asylees are a small part, and we now have done two things that are incredible. One is this week's news is the president wants to zero out the refugees. Now, Reagan allowed 250,000 in a year. Under most of the administrations for 20 years, we had about 70,000 on average coming into the United States. Then we had about 22,000 under Trump, so we've had this precipitous decline, and he's now pushing for zero for next year. Now, I'm not sure he'll get away with that, just like DACA and other things he's tried to do. I'm not sure it will happen, but the effort gives an enormous message to America. So we're in an ideological battle of rhetoric, like the 1 million people that are going to be rounded up when it comes down to 35 people who actually were rounded up on Sunday, rounded up being people who were actually taken by ICE and where they do have the basis for deportation. One of the things that is incredible is the rhetoric creates an environment of fear, terror, angst, re-traumatization, and we really have to understand what's happening in that community as being a war of words that is just as powerful as the war of law, the war of laws. Fantastic presentations, fantastic folks. I want you to have a chance to use this time going to 10:30. So have you been thinking? You got something you want to put on the table here for a question? It's yours. All right. You gave a whole lot of things we can do.
Yes. If you're not a lawyer, what can you do? So for example, in Rhode Island, you don't have to be a lawyer to learn how to do intake forms. You could, or to learn how to do family preparedness. We offer trainings for folks to come do intake, family preparedness. You can volunteer to help transport people to the ICE detention check-ins. We ask people to come out and go with families and individuals when you go to the ICE check-ins, because what we see is that if there's a crowd outside and ICE knows that community is watching, it's not 100%, but they're less likely to detain them right then and there. So those are a couple of ways.
At our
Donate money. Donate.
Donating money is always good, and in our Jesuit community of teaching at Boston College, the word accompaniment is a really good word. To stay with people, to befriend somebody in deportation proceedings, to be a pen pal, to be a correspondent, to know their story, to go with them when they make appearances so they are not alone in those experiences. Very powerful, both for the potential, for the immigrant in this story, as well as for the witnesses. And I watched the judge change her opinion the other day because there were 25 people showed up in the courtroom, and she says, it says here this person has no visible means of support. I can't accept that document, so she crossed it out and therefore released the person to the community. Those are powerful things we can do, as well as volunteering in ESL programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yes?
Well, first, thank you all for sharing your work and your personal stories. So, Anita, I know that you're trying to keep up with the news, but the latest news around immediate removal is just terrifying. And I'm looking at two gentlemen of color who probably are trying to understand what this means.
Yeah, it is.
Wondering if you could enlighten us a little bit.
So, and we've been sort of digesting the regs. I mean, it's the law. It's just it hadn't been used in this way to do sort of, complete use of the power of expedited removal. ICE and CBP had been sort of doing, if you've been in the U.S., and you're within 100 miles of a border, that they've been doing expedited removal for that. But now it's sort of anyone who's been here for less than 2 years anywhere in the U.S. is subject to expedited removal. That means if you're undocumented and you get arrested, you can be put into removal. You will actually just be removed. It's paper adjudication. You don't see a judge. So this kind of all came out yesterday. We've been trying to figure out how to update even our community presentation on this without setting off people in a mass panic. Some of the things that we're saying is if you have a fear of returning to your home country, make sure you explain that, because that would be one thing that could halt the expedited removal. If you say I have a fear of return, then there's another process that they have to use. They can't just expedite remove you. You would have a credible fear interview. Then if you pass that, you'd see a judge. But if you don't, then it's actually quite scary. And the other thing we're going to start telling people is start building documentation that you've been here for more than 2 years, which is a little ridiculous. Most of us shred our bills or throw things away, but that's going to become critical. It'll be on the immigrant subject to this removal to prove that they've been here for more than 2 years. For those who aren't, it's terrifying. It's.
Yeah, but like, would people need to show ID in the street? Like, that's kind of what I'm envisioning. Is that?
So actually, I was a part of our raids preparedness, Sarath. I'm sure you do the same thing. We actually tell people to carry copies. Yeah, and I don't know if you want to add.
I mean, yeah, I mean, carry copies. Yeah, Father, it's so sad. I'm just sad even like having to say this. Part of it is like making sure you do these things like giving power of attorney over to a family member, make copies. We give it to us so we can have a copy for you in case you need it, you know, so like, yeah.
And actually, there's different advice for if you're documented or if you're undocumented.
Right.
If you're undocumented, you probably don't want to carry around because
Yeah.
they'll use that against you.
Yeah.
To prove that you're not a U.S. citizen. If you're documented, and then you would actually produce it so you don't get arrested.
And it goes with that other question. This is, I call it Plan B, helping every undocumented person you know to have a power of attorney and a power of guardianship for children, and a contact system. If you suddenly have that father who's taken from the street, who's going to contact who, where, when, how? So families need to be challenged to really do a Plan B to carry themselves through and know how to survive this. And I love in Tucson, there are a lot of circles that have been created that are bond circles. If something happens in these circles, they act together on behalf of each other. It's shared risk pools. But it's an amazing sophistication in some ways as people try to help each other in a crisis.
Under the Domestic Violence Prevention Agency called Saheli.
Saheli.
Some of the work that we do overlaps with the kinds of issues that you've been talking about. And we are well trained in writing affidavits and accompanying clients to court, translating and interpreting. And we're also fortunate now, after 22 years, to offer small amounts of financial aid to people who are in deportation.
Wow.
The only constraint,
We're lining up at your door right now.
the only constraint is we are small, so we confine our work to South Asian women. So I'm offering those services to Anita in case you think that it will be helpful.
Oh, well, we all see folks from that part of the world. That is wonderful. Yes.
I just wanted to, one of the things, and thank you to all the panelists, it was great to hear from all of you. I work for the International Institute of New England, an organization that West used to be the executive director of. We have a program for unaccompanied minors. Last year we served about 200 unaccompanied minors and their families around this. And this is a topic that's been on the news every day, but I didn't hear a lot about today particularly, but it's something that I have a 2-year-old at home, and it's something that every day I just go home and think what a blessing it is that I see my kid every day, and I'm just really distraught about the policies that are going on. So if people know of other families that are in need of services in that area, that may be something that we could help with.
You're doing social casework.
Social casework.
Yeah.
We've got caseworkers that work at placing those families and reuniting them with their families once they're
And
out of detention.
Along with pair and kind is kind, which is the kids in need of defense. And this is, again, that same statistic. The kids who have legal defense are getting through the system. Those who don't are at enormous risk of being deported. And I think it's critical that we lift up these names and have people know.
It's something that I have a 2-year-old at home, and it's something that every day I just go home and think what a blessing it is that I see my kid every day, and I'm just really distraught about the policies that are going on. So if people know of other families that are in need of services in that area, that may be something that we could help with.
You're doing social casework.
Social casework.
Yeah.
We've got caseworkers that work at placing those families and reuniting them with their families once they're
And
out of detention.
Along with pair and kind is kind, which is the kids in need of defense. And this is, again, that same statistic. The kids who have legal defense are getting through the system. Those who don't are at enormous risk of being deported. And I think it's critical that we lift up these names and have people know.
It's something that I have a 2-year-old at home, and it's something that every day I just go home and think what a blessing it is that I see my kid every day, and I'm just really distraught about the policies that are going on. So if people know of other families that are in need of services in that area, that may be something that we could help with.
You're doing social casework.
Social casework.
Yeah.
We've got caseworkers that work at placing those families and reuniting them with their families once they're
And
out of detention.
Along with PAIR and KIND is KIND, which is the Kids in Need of Defense. And this is, again, that same statistic. The kids who have legal defense are getting through the system. Those who don't are at enormous risk of being deported. And I think it's critical that we lift up these names and have people know.
It's something that I have a 2-year-old at home, and it's something that every day I just go home and think what a blessing it is that I see my kid every day, and I'm just really distraught about the policies that are going on. So if people know of other families that are in need of services in that area, that may be something that we could help with.
You're doing social casework.
Social casework.
Yeah.
We've got caseworkers that work at placing those families and reuniting them with their families once they're
And
out of detention.
Along with PAIR and KIND is KIND, which is the Kids in Need of Defense. And this is, again, that same statistic. The kids who have legal defense are getting through the system. Those who don't are at enormous risk of being deported. And I think it's critical that we lift up these names and have people know.
It's something that I have a 2-year-old at home, and it's something that every day I just go home and think what a blessing it is that I see my kid every day, and I'm just really distraught about the policies that are going on. So if people know of other families that are in need of services in that area, that may be something that we could help with.
You're doing social casework.
Social casework.
Yeah.
We've got caseworkers that work at placing those families and reuniting them with their families once they're
And
out of detention.
Along with PAIR and KIND is KIND, which is the Kids in Need of Defense. And this is, again, that same statistic. The kids who have legal defense are getting through the system. Those who don't are at enormous risk of being deported. And I think it's critical that we lift up these names and have people know.
It's something that I have a 2-year-old at home, and it's something that every day I just go home and think what a blessing it is that I see my kid every day, and I'm just really distraught about the policies that are going on. So if people know of other families that are in need of services in that area, that may be something that we could help with.
You're doing social casework.
Social casework.
Yeah.
We've got caseworkers that work at placing those families and reuniting them with their families once they're
And
out of detention.
Along with PAIR and KIND is KIND, which is the Kids in Need of Defense. And this is, again, that same statistic. The kids who have legal defense are getting through the system. Those who don't are at enormous risk of being deported. And I think it's critical that we lift up these names and have people know.
It's something that I have a 2-year-old at home, and it's something that every day I just go home and think what a blessing it is that I see my kid every day, and I'm just really distraught about the policies that are going on. So if people know of other families that are in need of services in that area, that may be something that we could help with.
You're doing social casework.
Social casework.
Yeah.
We've got caseworkers that work at placing those families and reuniting them with their families once they're
And
out of detention.
Along with PAIR and KIND is KIND, which is the Kids in Need of Defense. And this is, again, that same statistic. The kids who have legal defense are getting through the system. Those who don't are at enormous risk of being deported. And I think it's critical that we lift up these names and have people know.
It's something that I have a 2-year-old at home, and it's something that every day I just go home and think what a blessing it is that I see my kid every day, and I'm just really distraught about the policies that are going on. So if people know of other families that are in need of services in that area, that may be something that we could help with.
You're doing social casework.
Social casework.
Yeah.
We've got caseworkers that work at placing those families and reuniting them with their families once they're
And
out of detention.
Along with PAIR and KIND is KIND, which is the Kids in Need of Defense. And this is, again, that same statistic. The kids who have legal defense are getting through the system. Those who don't are at enormous risk of being deported. And I think it's critical that we lift up these names and have people know.
It's something that I have a 2-year-old at home, and it's something that every day I just go home and think what a blessing it is that I see my kid every day, and I'm just really distraught about the policies that are going on. So if people know of other families that are in need of services in that area, that may be something that we could help with.
You're doing social casework.
Social workers that work at placing those families and reuniting them with their families
And
out of detention.
along with pair and kind is kind, which is the kids in need of defense. And this is, again, that same statistic. The kids who have legal defense are getting through the system. Those who don't are at enormous risk of being deported. And I think